You're listening to BioTalk with Rich Bendis, the only podcast focused on the biohealth capital region. Each episode, we'll talk to leaders in the industry to break down the biggest topics happening today in biohealth.
Hi, this is Rich Bendis. I'm host of BioTalk, and we have another interesting guest this week. Margaret Anderson is Managing Director, Deloitte Consulting. Margaret, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, a lot of people don't know you from Deloitte. They know you from other places that you have been, Margaret. So let's talk a little bit about your background.
Absolutely. So I recently joined Deloitte in the past year, and I was ready for kind of a new challenge, system opportunity. I had been the executive director of a group called Faster Cures, which is a center of the Milken Institute. And that had been a really important part of my career. It was, I think, a great opportunity to bring many of the sectors together in biomedical research together to work on some of the challenges and the impediments to progress. So what I bring to Deloitte is that system approach to the ecosystem and, trying to look at the challenges through the lens of, in particular, the patient. And that's the work that we did at Faster Cures.
Prior to Faster Cures, though, you had some other work that you did in Washington, D.C.
Absolutely. So I've spent my whole career in Washington. I essentially grew up here for almost my whole life. I went to school here. My father was in the military. And so I believe in public service. And so prior to joining Deloitte, I had been either in the government sector or not-for-profit sector my whole life. And my very first job out of grad school was a congressional agency called the Office of Technology Assessment, OTA. And it was an unbelievable place to start a career in science policy. The caliber of the people who worked there was extraordinary. Intelligence, it was very small, 200 people, very nimble, did quite exhaustive studies on pressing scientific and technological issues for Congress. It was bipartisan or nonpartisan, and we would receive requests to do studies and really try to kind of turn the coin around on these different issues. So I worked in the biology section at the beginning of kind of the biotechnology revolution in the United States. So we did a series on U.S. investment in biotechnology, some of the different types of biotechnology, ag biotechnology. Perhaps the funnest report I ever got to work on was the advent of DNA fingerprinting. And so we did field trips to the FBI, Quantico. I hung out with criminal lab directors and really looked at what were the issues there. Then looked at things like cystic fibrosis carrier screening, genetic testing in the workplace, which was quite a concern in the early days. And then I didn't participate on this particular study, but we did a very important study for Congress on the Human Genome Project, as they were deliberating that and trying to decide how to allocate their resources. So the OTA experience for me was formative in teaching me how to do policy analysis, but also trying to understand the perspective from all of the different stakeholders. And so that opportunity then turned into other opportunities for me working in the public health sector. At the beginning of the HIV/AIDS epidemic, I led HIV policy for the American Public Health Association and the Society for Women's Health Research, looking at gender-based science and, what did we know and what did we need to know. And then I did some consulting at a group that did a lot of work with the Centers for Disease Control, also in the HIV space. And that was a really important opportunity to understand the federal perspective and also how the federal perspective, sort of flowed into the state perspective. So states receive money to do HIV work. And so we would look at how that money was distributed, how could they plan to disseminate that at the community level. So I've had, amazing, fun, interesting, challenging jobs in my career. And I'm always looking for that next challenge, and that's one of the reasons I came to Deloitte. Why did I join, Deloitte and took on this role to do consulting and learn about the art of consulting? For me, it was the platform opportunity that Deloitte represents in terms of the scale. Deloitte works across, I'm in the federal health arena, so with essentially every federal agency, the commercial life science sector, supporting most of the major biopharmaceutical companies and, some of the more emerging ones in any number of ways. And then we have a very exciting not-for-profit practice that is providing services to not-for-profits at various stages of the journey, from strategic planning, business planning, some communications work, really looking at this whole area of patient centricity, very major presence on data analytics, patient registry creation. So for me, I needed to go somewhere that had diversity and scale and opportunity for being creative. All of those things, Deloitte helps me to achieve. I think for me, working in a place that is too constrained by topic area or sector, I looked at some of those types of opportunities and I felt like for me, I would probably not thrive, that I really like to be in places where, there's kind of no balance to the opportunity.
It's also probably nice to have access to all the resources Deloitte has rather than having to go out and find resources in the not-for-profit world.
Absolutely. I mean, the Deloitte model is that we, do work all over the world in all of the different sectors and have all sorts of offerings. And there's a collegiality in terms of finding people and resources within Deloitte to help you strategize and a real receptivity. So, the number of Deloitte practitioners who want to work on some of the not-for-profit endeavors, people who are impacted by some of the conditions that we're, looking at. What you see in these large companies is that they are impacted themselves by challenges in the system, whether it's being cancer survivors or being parents of children with diseases like type 1 diabetes. They themselves want to see the system go more quickly and be more efficient. And so there's a willingness in all respects, I think, to jump in and help. And that's been remarkable for me. It's really, sort of an endless runway, and that can be daunting in that it's hard to sort of find the end of the runway to figure out, okay, where do these resources end and how do we aggregate them? But it's exciting. It's also, I'll point out too, and I think this is relevant to the biohealth sector that you're engaged with, Rich, which is, you really want to look at the age range of who are the employees and who are going to be the employees of the future. So certainly in terms of STEM, what kind of workplaces they want for the future. I want to be around people who are smarter than me. They don't have to be younger, but I think young folks are going to do things differently, look at things differently. And so it's nice to be in an area that has so much of that, to offer.
We're speaking with Margaret Anderson, Managing Director, Deloitte Consulting, and you've had an interesting runway, as you say, government, nonprofit, all elements of the healthcare industry. So where do you see the healthcare in America being positioned today?
Obviously, we're in this time of change and transition in many ways, and the healthcare sector, I think, probably more than any. I think we've already witnessed a lot of transformation around the way care gets delivered, the expectations from the consumer/patient for what does that care look like. Certainly how we're reimbursing it and, what that cost is. So this whole area of focusing on value and how is value being delivered, whether it's on the care delivery side or the treatment cure side in terms of the products. But I think, the fundamental theme that I'll keep going back to is the role of the patient and consumer. And, we're seeing it in the R&D side, and I know we'll talk a little bit about that. But in the healthcare side, if you think about how customers today in just our daily life, we are so attuned to having things at the, kind of touch of a finger on our phone, on our device, on our computer. I just literally, as I walked out the house today, we had a package delivery of sponges. And it was because I think I purchased some sort of vitamin and, said, oh, we need sponges. Let's throw that in. So we can access things so much more easily and engage with the sort of customer service world differently. Everything is customized. We go to Starbucks, we get our customized drink. My daughter gets customized beauty boxes. You can get customized fashion, customized pet treats. And the place that we really haven't customized is healthcare. And, I would say on the R&D side of research, we're getting there, and there's certainly a great pathway forward. But
this is really the personalized medicine you're talking about.
Absolutely. But the patient and the customer, I think, are going to demand more customization in terms of how service gets delivered. And guess what? They're paying for it. And that's the other thing is I think that more and more increasingly, the American healthcare customer is going to realize how much money they are paying out of pocket. And they're going to start aggregating that cost and expecting a different experience. And so, that's something that I've been excited to learn about at Deloitte is user-centered design and how can we think about the customer as we're building things. So that's, to me, the fundamental shift that we're going to see. I think all of the healthcare policy issues that are happening in Washington, sometimes they get a little bit, to me, separated from that fundamental need, which is what does the patient customer need? And I'll speak a little bit to a public health perspective, which is the U.S. economy. We really need to pay attention to public health and prevention and look at our spend in preventable diseases and what can we be doing to be working on those. So I think that, to me, is going to get circled in to the R&D cycle, that we're going to have to pay closer attention to public health and to how that product or service is going to actually be delivered in the marketplace.
It's interesting to talk about patient and then customer and then patient customer, because I'm sure with Faster Cures, it was patient advocacy and public policy around patients. Has this shift in your terminology occurred recently because of your shift to Deloitte, focusing more on customer or patient customer than what you did in your prior life?
I don't think so. I do think, though, what you are seeing in the R&D sector is that there's a little bit of ambiguity about the term patient. Should we call people patients? Should we call them partners? Should we call them consumers, customers? In fact, even the term patient centricity has a multitude of meanings if you think about the end user. So that is one thing that we looked at very carefully at Faster Cures was be mindful of what is the context by which you're doing your work and be mindful of what those words mean to the different people that you're interacting with. This idea of the customer, though, I think it is a blend coming over from the healthcare world, but I think R&D and the life science world is starting that journey of trying to figure out how they can, kind of meet their customer needs, i.e. the patient. And that's relatively new. I spoke at the Biohealth meeting around how, the idea that a patient would receive their literal diagnosis of their disease is only 40 years old. That was through the patient's Bill of Rights. And so I think sometimes we don't reflect enough on how quickly the journey has happened, that we've been seeing some of the system change. But I do think we're in accelerated times, and so we're going to see it go faster.
And you mentioned the Biohealth Capital Regional Forum, which you were a moderator of an interesting panel, and it was on patient advocacy, I think. But one of the things we talk about, rather than the term biotechnology, is biohealth. And the reason we coined the region that and our organization Biohealth is because of the convergence of what's happening within the healthcare industry, biotechnology, pharmaceuticals, medical devices, electronic health records, data analytics, all converging together. How do you see that impacting healthcare in the future?
I love the phraseology that you just put forward. I think that captures where we want to head, as a sector. And so we do have some reframing to do in terms of just thinking about disease and reframe it to think about health and wellness. And certainly you're even seeing it in large biopharma companies where they're calling themselves a healthcare company, not a, kind of pharmaceutical
pharma company or a bio company.
Absolutely. Right. So I'm a big fan of that. I think that's where we need to do more work and think about how can we get the healthcare industry to start actually delivering healthcare, not sick care. And, how do we get ahead of the curve? And certainly, I think in our lifetime, we're going to see the opportunity to prevent diseases and really get, sort of ahead of fixing some of the problems, not just public health prevention, but literally gene therapy, things like that. So I think that it's a shift that's happening, but I don't think that we're probably all on the same page with that, what we mean by it.
I think that's obvious. There isn't one page right now in America. Yeah. But now you're a consultant. So you have the ability as a consultant to make recommendations from what you have seen from the many different sides of healthcare. What would your action plan be for America as a consultant to this administration or any other administration of where we need to go?
So the number one thing would be to take a 360-degree view of the situation. I spoke recently at the National Quality Forum meeting, and that was not an area that I had worked on too specifically, this area of quality measures. And I encourage the panel and the audience to be thinking about patient perspective or customer perspective, both in the quality measure field, but also in the R&D space. And so connecting the dots between the work that a not-for-profit like the Parent Project Muscular Dystrophy, who spoke at the Biohealth Summit, they work to try to de-risk the science to get more treatments in muscular dystrophy. But we need to not just look at it for, what is a patient perspective that needs to go into the R&D cycle. We need to look at it in the care delivery. What matters to that patient? Because I think 10 to 1, what matters to the patient will look different than what we think matters. And so that's my number one recommendation is think a little bit more, 360. The second one would be this idea of public health and prevention. Let's make sure while we're rushing to work on the healthcare delivery system, make sure that we have treatments and cures to offer people, that we're not overlooking opportunity to prevent diseases and pay attention to the public health, sort of aspect of it. And then I'd say the third thing would just be this general concept of patients as partners. You're going to see the All of Us research study being launched, I think, this Sunday in May. And, that is the big cohort, 1 million people that NIH is trying to accrue. They have really done a lot of important work reframing patients into partners, trying to get people interested in the idea of participating in this cohort study for the long haul. It's kind of a Framingham 2.0 study. So I think if everyone in the healthcare and R&D system can view the world as patients, think of them as patients, as partners, we'll be in a better place.
Sounds like you need to do a white paper with your recommendations on the 360.
I think I'll take that under consideration. Thank you.
Yeah, great. When we talk about the role of government and industry, which we focused on, you come from Faster Cures, where you spent some of your time. There's also a major role for nonprofits and NGOs. And I think there's also a fine line between what a nonprofit and NGO does in the nonprofit world, but they also have to be concerned about sustainability. One that we have in our backyard that has done a great job on sustainability that a lot of them would emulate would be the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, who has invested in some company that did research, had a major win, got about $3.5 to $4 billion. They're sustained for life, but they're in the minority. So what do you see as the model for a lot of these nonprofits who are worried about patients improving their quality of life and what they should be doing as it relates to high-risk early-stage research and the role they play with the researcher or the company that they're engaged with?
Absolutely. So there's a lot to unpack there. Let's start with the cystic fibrosis example, because I like to ask, is it a unicorn or are we going to see more of that? I want to amend your statement just a tiny bit to say that Cystic Fibrosis Foundation didn't just invest in a company. They actually found the company.
Created the company.
They followed the money when it was Aurora Biosciences, right, and went over to Vertex. And then they partnered beyond the money in sort of the 360 view of the clinical trials, the clinical care, centers that they have, data. So CF, they are the grandfather, so to speak, of the venture philanthropy model. And that was true before the royalty stream that they took. Now, the other thing I would say is that you probably, if you spoke to them, I bet they would say that their job's not done and they're not convinced that that royalty stream is going to fix the problem for the people.
$4 billion might not be enough.
Right.
Really.
So that's the fundamental thing about these not-for-profits, right? They will not rest until they have fixed the problem, whatever that problem is. It might be the fundamental mechanics of the disease, or it might be how is that treatment being delivered into the care delivery setting. Now, I'm not saying they all want to stay open forever. They all would love to not be open. What they have offered, I always say this, they have offered, sort of a path forward to the entire life science and healthcare sector. Now, the challenge here, you've raised one challenge, and I'll put another one out there. The challenge that you raised is sustainability, and that is a major consideration for these groups. And that, one of the things that we do in our not-for-profit practice is work with organizations on that, how can they be ready for the challenges ahead, both in terms of, challenges that we know are coming, but fundraising challenges. So, that model of having walkathons or lemonade stands or, you name it, everybody wants to find the, wealthy donor who is going to help, keep the organization afloat. But even organizations that have that, there's no guarantee. So that's a big chunk of time that these groups spend focusing on that problem. And I always like to point out that many of these groups have no endowments, so they start at zero at the beginning of the year. And imagine being a CEO who has that responsibility in addition to, oh, by the way, go lead cutting edge science and fix the disease. A huge, huge mandate. So hats off to all of these groups because they, CF and many, many others have really kind of put a spotlight on what's possible. So I think that whole fundraising sustainability is an issue. The other challenge I'll throw out there is, what if you wake up and you have a disease and you go to the internet and they don't have a not-for-profit for you? Do you have to start one? I don't think that that's a sustainable model either. And I think to put that burden, on everybody out there, oh, now you have to go create a group, that's a whole weight to bear. So I'm a big fan of what are the lessons learned? What are we learning from these groups? How can we teach the system what they're doing? And who can take on some of that responsibility if they don't have a group? And I think in some of these areas, in oncology, you're seeing groups collaborating. You're certainly seeing companies having to collaborate differently. The scientists are collaborating because they're thinking about immunotherapy as an example. I sit on the board of the Melanoma Research Alliance. Job's not done on immunotherapy. Amazing progress, but people are still dying. People are having side effects that, to the point that we were talking about earlier, the healthcare system isn't quite ready for prime time in terms of even just dealing with some of the kind of spontaneous side effects. So one case I know about, I heard a scientist clinician speaking recently that they had to create almost a little laminated card to hand to their clinical trial patients so that if they were having some of the serious side effects that were possible, they could go to the ER and hand that card over because the ER they weren't acting quickly enough on whatever the issue was. So
it's like your bracelet, basically.
Yeah, it's getting the system. It's another example of getting the system to talk to each other. And that's where I'll riff on one other topic, which is, the amount of data that we're generating, both in terms of data, just for research, but how could a healthcare provider possibly keep up with this incredible onslaught that we're having? So I think there's many fundamental challenges that we have to figure out, and the not-for-profits are paying it forward in terms of the models that they're putting forward. They are back to the issue about the healthcare system. Many of these groups were created for R&D purposes, but as we saw, some of the reimbursement challenges crop up, many of the groups said, hey, we're creating data. Why don't we look at, is that data of value to the payer community, and can we talk to them about the patient perspective? And many of them are doing that. Now, the thing I always like to say to the companies is, you might have a building of people that do this work, that are trained in it, that are steeped in it, and the not-for-profit that we met last week has 12 people. Right. And yet they have had a fantastic impact on their disease.
Let's talk more about the things that you're involved with day in and day out. And that's really your new federal role with Deloitte. We talked about the challenges with the healthcare system, what some of your recommendations would be. Now, as a consultant with Deloitte in the federal practice, where do you see you can have the greatest impact and also get great job satisfaction out of what you're doing day in and day out?
Well, thank you. It's a good question. So, I
have the first good one.
I have the privilege of getting to work across many of the federal health agencies, and so far, I'm very early in my journey. The value add that I think I've been able to provide is, first of all, kind of an outside-in perspective. So, bringing forward some of the observations that I had accrued over the years, because let me also point out that the Milken Institute is almost an economic policy think tank. So private equity, the capital markets, to your point about commercialization, what are the things that companies are facing going forward? Those were all things that I had exposure to. So bringing that expertise of some of the commercial challenges into the federal sector is one area. And then this not-for-profit piece, I think every federal agency that we work with and that I have worked with in my career, they want to solve problems. They want to do it efficiently, effectively. They want to be sort of accessible to the market. And so those are all things that Deloitte gets to work on and we can be helpful in. I think that there's some really interesting opportunities right now around clinical innovation and research innovation. We did a transition team report at Faster Cures before I left. We interviewed over 100 different experts across the sectors, CEOs of companies, et cetera, and said, what would you do if, you were offering ideas to the next administration? And so that report is still, I think, kind of evergreen in terms of some of the things around innovation. There was a real hunger from the outside to see the federal government behave in a more 360 way. And really, I think you're seeing that right now with FDA, with HHS, with certainly CDC in terms of the public health aspect, but obviously with NIH. And that is exciting. There is so much good, kind of promising stuff coming out of these federal agencies. So I always like to give a shout out to, folks who are working in those agencies because they work tirelessly and don't get a lot of thanks all the time, but they're really pushing forward, I think, novel, interesting ideas and policies. And I think there's a real receptivity to that right now.
Well, you mentioned NIH. We're focused for Governor Hogan with a Life Science Advisory Board, and I've been asked to chair the Federal Commercialization Task Force. And we have a couple of initiatives, but one I want to visit with you about a little bit is the conflict of interest policy at NIH right now. And is that something that what I'm going to ask you is that we have 27 institutes right here in Maryland, basically Montgomery County, 6,000 scientists, and an intramural research budget of $3.1 billion a year.
10% or a little bit under
10%
of the total
NIH budget. The challenge we have is it's the largest amount of early stage, high risk research funding in the world in one geographical location. But unfortunately, industry and investors have a very difficult time getting access to what you would classify as commercially relevant research and finding ways to extract it out of NIH to look at trying to advance it to get towards the commercial world if they can because of the strict conflict of interest policies. Have you encountered that, and have you have any opinions on what we could do differently to address that?
Well, I think shining a spotlight is something that is certainly an opportunity for you to educate people. One thing I think is that people are not clear on what those policies are and why they would be a constraint to what you're describing. So I think that's one opportunity for you. I would put the question back to you and say, is there something beyond just the conflict of interest that is a challenge? Because what I witnessed, in the last decade is that there's oftentimes you can, sort of put a little bit of light on what some of the policies are and see if there are doors that can be opened.
Yeah, there was a major issue about 12 years ago, which you may be aware of, that really changed the paradigm around commercialization within NIH, and actually they went too far. And what we wanted to do is just come back into the middle a little bit more, and industry and investors would find that refreshing. So we're in the process of writing a white paper on that can be presented, because we're trying to determine whether it requires congressional action or not, or is it really just a policy issue which can be managed internally without having to get Congress involved. So stay tuned. That's something that we're going to continue to work on and may draw upon some of your expertise on that.
One thing I'll mention during the whole lead up to the 21st Century Cures Act, there were times that agencies wanted something in legislation, even if they had the authority to do it, because it gave them, this other
party,
place to be able to
basically.
turn to.
Correct.
So I'm not saying that the case is the same necessarily with what you're describing, but that can happen.
So we're talking to Margaret Anderson, Managing Director, Deloitte Consulting, and we're getting close to the end of this interview, but I want to ask you two last things. One, you're not a job hopper. You've had a really nice, steady career and progression. You're at Deloitte now, but what would you see as your future goals 5 to 10 years down the road for yourself?
Honestly, the exciting thing for me about being at Deloitte is that I could see being there for the entire rest of my career, in that, you know, the job that I had at Faster Cures, the job I had at Faster Cures changed, I would say, probably every year. And some of that was my making. You know, I wanted it to change. And so that for me is a criteria that I look for. Am I going to learn, grow? You know, is there more runway? And I can tell you it's an endless runway, you know, as I referred to at Deloitte. So my goals, you know, are simple, which is I want to create system change. And I try every day in terms of the interactions that I have, the work that I'm leading, the work that I'm doing, to offer that opportunity. The other thing is I need a place where I can bring, you know, Deloitte calls it the authentic self. I need to be able to bring who I am and my background and my experience. And, you know, so a place that would constrain that is not going to work well for me. I'm also, like I said, I'm very interested in what is the next generation or two below us going to offer the system, both in terms of the science, you know, which is hot. Some of these business ideas that you're talking about in terms of commercialization, how would they solve a problem? You know, in terms of the whole area of patient centricity, I can imagine that, you know, future generations are going to say, what are you talking about? Why did you stand for this? I mean, sometimes you look back at history and think that's insane that was the way it was. So I'm very interested in learning and understanding what are other ways to solve these problems and bring forward these kind of unbelievable scientific advancements that I think that we're going to witness in our lifetime, even more than what we've seen. I mean, the thing that motivates me, I mean, maybe the flip side of the question around what are your goals is what motivates people. And what motivates me are, you know, just like everybody, personal stories, people that I know or knew who are no longer with us because we didn't get the answer quickly enough. I'm wearing, you know, a breast cancer bracelet of a friend who, you know, lived across the street and left behind her 2 children. Triple negative breast cancer, we don't have an answer yet. Pancreatic cancer, we don't have an answer. Alzheimer's, we don't have an answer. You know, so many rare diseases. And then things like antibiotic resistance. That's the challenge and the opportunity about this area is that we're never probably going to be done. There will always be something else that pops up. I find that incredibly motivating. I've had the privilege of witnessing transformation in the HIV/AIDS space. I worked at APHA at the beginning of the epidemic. We had a meeting that was taken over by ACT UP. I mean, it was an unbelievably poignant time because people were dying. And I ran support groups at the Whitman Walker Clinic. My support groups ran 9 weeks, and people didn't always make it to the end of the 9-week cycle. I still have friends who have been, you know, their lives have been saved and transformed by the treatments that were created. And so that, for me, that's it. That's the motivator.
I think you talk about Deloitte with authenticity, and I don't think anything's going to compromise your position, and you might have found your home for life.
Thank you. I hope so.
So, and I don't think really we can close with any last thoughts better than the one you just had. So we've had the opportunity to talk with Margaret Anderson, Managing Director for Deloitte Consulting. Margaret, thank you for being on BioTalk today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening to BioTalk with Rich Bendis.